Imagine writing the word think without the letters T and H. Sounds impossible, right? Well, for hundreds of years, that's exactly how English worked. Instead, people used a single letter called thorn. So, where did it go? Ironically, it wasn't English that killed thorn. It was the printing press. Most printing presses brought in from Europe didn't have the letter, so printers replaced it with Y because the two looked almost the same in medieval handwriting. That's why you'll still see old signs saying "Ye Old Shop." Despite what most people think, it was never pronounced ye. It was always supposed to be read as the. But thorn wasn't the only letter that disappeared. English also had another letter for the TH sound called eth. Unlike thorn, which was mostly used in words like think, eth usually showed up in words like this, that, and these. The weird part? People back then didn't really follow one set of rules. Sometimes they'd use thorn, sometimes eth, and sometimes they'd even use both in the same document. So why keep two letters that did almost the same job? As English slowly settled into the alphabet we know today, people started replacing both letters with the much simpler TH. It was easier to read, easier to teach, and easier for everyone to use. Just like that, eth disappeared, leaving TH to do all the work. The letter win. Long before the letter W existed, English used a letter called win for the exact same sound. It wasn't some weird symbol hidden away in old books either. If you were reading or writing English back then, chances are you'd see win almost every day. Then English started to change. As Latin became more common, people slowly stopped using letters that weren't part of the Latin alphabet. Since Latin didn't have win, scribes came up with a simple fix. They started writing two U's side by side instead. It wasn't the prettiest solution, but it got the job done. Over time, those double U's slowly merged into a single letter, giving us the W we still use today. Win slowly fell out of use, and before long, most people forgot it had ever existed. But here's the cool part. W is still the only letter in the alphabet whose name tells you exactly how it was made. Yog. If you think English spelling is confusing now, well, blame this guy. Yog could make several different sounds depending on the word. Sometimes it sounded like Y, other times like G, and in some cases, it made a rough sound that's completely disappeared from modern English. That made it really useful, but it also made reading and writing a lot more confusing. When the printing press arrived, printers ran into the exact same problem they had with thorn. They didn't have a letter for yog, so they started replacing it with other letters like G, Y, or even GH, depending on which one looked the closest. That's why words like night, laugh, and those still have a silent GH today. Yog might be gone, but every time you spell one of those words, you're still seeing the mess it left behind. Insular G. Believe it or not, English once had two different ways of writing the letter G. One of them was the insular G, a rounded symbol that showed up all over Old English manuscripts. It wasn't there just to look different. Back then, it was simply another way of writing G. But just like a lot of other Old English letters, it didn't survive once the Latin alphabet started taking over. People slowly stopped using it and switched to the simpler G we're familiar with today. Its shape disappeared from English, but the letter that replaced it is one you probably write every single day. Ash. At first glance, it just looks like someone glued an A and an E together. But for centuries, Ash was a real letter in the English alphabet. It made a vowel sound in many words, including words like ash, making reading and writing a little clearer. But over time, people stopped treating it like its own letter. Instead, they just wrote A or AE, and little by little, ash stopped showing up in everyday English. It never completely went away though. You'll still find it hiding in old books, dictionaries, and even a few names today. Long S. If you've ever opened an old English book and wondered why every S looks like an F, you're not imagining things. For centuries, English used two different versions of the letter S. The long S showed up at the beginning or middle of words, while the short S was only used at the end. It wasn't a different sound or even a different letter. It was just a writing rule that everyone followed. But by the late 1700s, printers started getting rid of the long S altogether. It made books easier to read, easier to print, and a whole lot less confusing for everyone. Which is probably a good thing, because trying to read an old English book without knowing this feels like you're reading a completely different alphabet. The letter eng. You've probably used this letter thousands of times without ever writing it. Eng made the NG sound in words like sing, ring, and long. Instead of using two separate letters, Old English treated that sound as a letter of its own. It was simple, it was efficient, and honestly, it made a lot of sense. But as English slowly moved over to the Latin alphabet, people started writing NG instead. Before long, eng stopped showing up in everyday writing. The crazy part is, the sound never went anywhere. We just started using two letters to do the job of one.